It's funny. I often get asked, Jared, by individual clients and colleagues and all that, like, hey, if we were to start logging things, what are the four areas of our application which we log, right?
Mm.
The number one answer is authentication is always really important, right? Like the first thing, even with Azure, if people are going to bypass and come and use your Azure services, they have to bypass authentication. So success and failure of authentication is probably the number one thing that people should be logging and alerting on. But then they ask us like, well, failure, I get it, because it looks like someone is trying to brute force the password. Why success? It's like success is also important because maybe you look at patterns. Hey, Farshad never logs in at 2 a.m, but he logged in at 2 a.m. on Tuesday. That should be alert. So success is important because you could see anomalous patterns in people logging in, and failure is important because it could be bypassing brute force potentially. The other three that are important is failure of authorization. Because if someone is using the endpoint or APIs normally, then they wouldn't fail on authorization. It's only you fail on authorization when you're trying to access something you're not supposed to. So that's the reason that you should be alerting on that. And then the other two is if you have an application API endpoint, you should make sure that failure of input validation as well as deserialization failures should also be logged. Again, those are, why would you fail on input? Oh, that's because someone put malicious input. Or why would you fail on deserialization? Someone wasn't following the normally serialized format. Those all could be because people are doing reconnaissance on the application. Now, on the infrastructure layer, again, it should be based on threat model. So, like as Jared was saying, if you have blob storage that's exposed to the outside, that's pretty important. You're exposing it externally. Make sure you turn on a bunch of things. Again, don't collect all the logs, but for the alerting, make sure you fine tune those with the threat scenarios. Now, let's talk about security center, because that's sort of the primary tool that sort of unifies security management within Azure, right? And it's probably the first thing people should start doing, and it allows companies to continually monitor all their resources across Azure, but also the cool thing is also on premises as well, and other clouds, certain other clouds. So it's kind of not just limited to Azure. You can centralize everything. Now, sometimes people ask me like, why would I use that? Like, what about a full SIM? Well, yeah, let's not confuse this with like, this is not supposed to replace a SIM. This is supposed to be a good sort of starting point. And then, if you want to add a full-blown SIM, which you probably should, Azure has the Sentinel product, which is their cloud-native SIM. But, Jared, what else about Security Center that our audience should know about?
I think you've covered a lot of it. I mean, it's essentially, they've named that one well. It's the Sentinel.
Totally.
Yeah. It's where everything goes to. It's, it doesn't work on its own. It needs to be configured to work with all the other services, but...
I was going to say one thing that a lot of our clients do as soon as they get an Azure, they just turn it on because it gives them a quick score. Yeah. It's like, hey, you haven't turned on MFA. It's all the basics, right? Like, so after listening to this podcast, if you have Azure, I recommend just going in there and looking at the dashboard and seeing what your score is. And then it just gives you some guidance, right? Like go turn on the 2FA and a few other things that you should be doing.
And by the way, some of those recommendations won't necessarily apply to you. And so that a lot of that has to do with tweaking the policies that you have turned on. Sometimes some of them are good recommendations, but not entirely necessary depending on the scale of your business. So one thing that I often see is it will make recommendations. It will say that you failed a check for whether or not you've used the sort of the bring your own key system. So it says right now you're using a Microsoft managed key, but you should be using your own customer managed key, which, by the way, great suggestion. I do think it's not even my opinion. It's just that will help secure your system. But, if you're not a huge business yet, or you're not protecting medical data or financial data, those are the kinds of things that you can disable until you've reached a point where you're either storing that type of data or you're a big enough target. Because otherwise what happens is you get a humongous backlog of items to clean up based on wanting to get the big green circle in Microsoft Security Center.